Hi, I'm Karl Horky. I am a developer I'm originally from Canada, and I'm living currently in Vienna right now. And yeah, I usually work with JavaScript, and I also follow web standards and React quite heavily. Yeah, so what we're going to be talking about today is the effect of React on web standards. We have some lovely sponsors as well. And if you guys need the Wi-Fi password, okay. I wonder if this is going to get cut off. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if it's going to get cut off. Yeah, so what are we actually going to be talking about today? So we're going to be talking about web standards. So what web standards are, who makes web standards, how web standards are made, so the process that they go through, and the discontent, so the problems that both the React community and then also the community in general, so JavaScript community and web developers in general have with web standards. We'll be talking about new approaches as well. So that means different libraries and frameworks that have taken different approaches and also different languages. We're going to be talking about React. So React is one of these new frameworks, new libraries, whatever you want to call it, that takes a new approach to certain things. We're going to be talking about the paradigms with React. We're going to be talking about how it embraces standards and how it rejects standards, and the comparison to stuff like web components. So there's a number of specs that are called web components. We'll be talking about that. Who's involved and other influences. And we're talking about the proposals. So there's, for instance, the TC39 is one group that we're going to be talking about today that has different proposals for what becomes new in JavaScript. And we're also going to be talking about what the future could look like. I'm not a prophesizer. I can't tell you what the future is going to look like, but we can see some general trends. So when I'm talking about React, I'm not talking about just the library. So I'm not talking about, yeah, Facebook made this Vue library, and you can make UI components with it. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the effect of, for instance, the paradigm. So the paradigms that are introduced by React on web standards. So, for instance, the paradigm is something like declaring your web UIs declaratively. So being able to make different kinds of output targets. So if you React doesn't just write to the DOM, so the DOM is one target, but you can also, for instance, write to a native app, or you can write to, there are certain libraries that allow you to write to command line applications, or maybe you want to make some music with React, there's libraries for that. We're going to be talking about the ecosystem. So the ecosystem behind React, so basically all of the developers and all of the libraries and everything. So the effect of that also on web standards. And also the philosophy. So the philosophy behind React, so that is minimalism, functional programming, immutability, these kinds of things. So this will go throughout the whole topic. So web standards. What are web standards? So here's an example of web standards. So it's just simple DOM manipulation. We have some H1 that we're adding, and we're going to create a text node, and we're going to add that in there. And this is, if you're used to something else, like React, I guess you could call it more modern or a different kind of approach, then maybe this looks like a lot of boilerplate to you. It's a lot of code. Same with confusing things like the this keyword. So what do you get in certain contexts when you're calling a function? So it's the this keyword can be a confusing thing. For instance, the video tag. So this was something that was introduced in HTML5, and it has these imperative APIs that you use to interact with them. Or another example is XML HTTP request. So this is basically what everyone knows as AJAX. So again, a lot of code to do something that you may be able to do easier in other things. Also custom elements. So custom elements is one of the specs of web components. And so this is how you would make a custom component. So this is kind of like a React component that maybe you guys are familiar with. And so there's a lot of imperative stuff going on, like you're assigning styles, and it's based on the order, and there's not a whole lot of visual representation as to what the end result is going to be. So we'll see how various different approaches make this better. So which organizations? So who is behind web standards? So we have a number of different organizations. We have the technical advisory groups and the technical working groups, a whole bunch of different CSS and also performance and other kinds of working groups. But these are the ones, there's a lot more than just this, but these are the ones that are relevant to us. And what we're mainly going to be talking about is actually the TC39. Yeah, so these spec groups, who are they made up of? So they're made up of these fairly large companies, mostly. There's also some invited experts or some people that are more singular kind of people that are invited to these groups, but for the most part, it's made up of large companies. And who actually makes it so that these things become reality for developers? So who makes it so that web standards actually exist? And that's even a smaller amount of big companies. So these are, so to say, the gatekeepers to the standards. So if something goes really far in the specification process, then even at the very end, then these guys can decide, no, actually, we don't really want it, or it's not going to show up in the browser. So for that reason, web standards are consensus-based. So that means that they all need to agree on what they want to do. And so yeah, multiple different stakeholders are involved here. So that means that recommendations can be ignored, and sometimes there's like non-standards paths, and there's also things that have happened where vendors block the standards. So vendors, they decide, no, we don't want this one. So there was a spec called ES4. I don't know if maybe some of you guys know it, but basically it was something that was going to be like ES6. So ES6 is the big bang. It's got like everything, all of these big new features in it. And ES4 was kind of like that. It actually had even more stuff than that. And Microsoft blocked it basically for a really long time, and stuff kind of was stalled. Yeah, and an example of like non-standards paths are things like Internet Explorer's JScript. So that was like an alternative form of JavaScript. Or like what Chrome is doing with these passive touch listeners right now. So if yeah, it's not really too important. It's just Chrome deals with touch listeners a little bit differently right now, and they're kind of breaking a little bit of stuff. But yeah, anyway, so these are basically non-standards non-standards paths. So it's not all doom and gloom though. So the standards guys, so these browser vendors, they're actually committed in the last few years. They've been more committed to being good citizens on the web. So basically saying, yeah, we're going to have these guidelines. We want to make a compatible web, and we want to have everything work properly for you guys and be standard across browsers. So that's nice. That's good. But the takeaway here is that web standards are fundamentally different than libraries. So if you're thinking of like a library like React or some kind of framework, then you usually have this kind of monoculture where you can the organization can decide how they want it to go. They can have they can decide basically what they want in and what they want out, and they can deprecate stuff. They can make breaking changes. So Angular 1 to 2, like big, huge breaking changes. Yeah, React doesn't do that as much. That's luckily so. But basically, you don't have as many stakeholders, and you don't need to ask as many people. So what are the problems that people have with web standards? We can start with the excessive boilerplate. So we were talking about this a little bit earlier. So how we were looking at the everything is verbose. Like you have a lot of code basically to do something that's simple, so to say. We have like incompatible missing implementations. So that means that across different browsers, you have incompatibilities. If you go to Internet Explorer 6, you can't expect that certain things are going to work. If you go to the latest Firefox, you can't expect that some things are going to work. And you also have insufficient components. So basically the primitives, so the available tags, the available elements that you have are, in some people's opinions, not enough. So, for instance, Ken Wheeler said that you want to have like more ability to compose your application. So you want to have more of these widget type of components available to you. So for instance, a day picker, or I mean, day picker is kind of there now, but it's not really everywhere either, and it's not really great. Or you have like a time picker or an autocomplete or something. Why aren't these part of the platform? You have confusing or non-memorable syntax, so substring versus subster. So this is kind of like this idea, why can't I just get started on something, and why can't I just do it all from memory? You can't keep everything in your head, but maybe it can be a little bit better. And there's also this kind of imperative approach to a lot of the DOM, and so it's stateful. So that means that in any particular point, you have to keep all of the history and how it got to this point in your head. So you need to be able to reason about that. So this led to people taking stuff into their own hands, basically. So jQuery, Dojo, Prototype, these were examples of people trying to simplify the DOM APIs. So we have like an example of this Ajax here, which is a little bit simpler than the previous one, and you're working with something that looks a little bit more like data here. So here's also an example of doing some DOM manipulation, which was, yeah, a little bit more wall of texty before. And yeah, doing some simple selectors and things like that. The interesting thing is here that these things are actually making their way into web standards too. So this is where it kind of comes to the point of the talk, is that these kind of approaches, so that are proposed by libraries, by frameworks, they do get noticed. And so if they are widespread enough and they are providing a good enough API, then they actually get into the standards, and then everyone can use them. They're widespread, and yeah. So that was the case in the case of jQuery with document query selector all. Another example, so in 2009 was CoffeeScript. So I don't know if some of you guys used this. I did for a while as well, and yeah, then I luckily switched to ES6. But yeah, so CoffeeScript had some interesting ideas where they were they made it easier to use this, for instance. So this @ symbol, for instance, here, that's this. So the class-based syntax is a little bit simplified. They had some new features like comprehensions and just some things that they thought were interesting new features to the language. So they proposed these things, and actually another thing was that CoffeeScript's arrow did eventually get to ES6 as well. So this was something that inspired web standards again. So moving on to 2009 to 11, we're looking at these more frameworky kind of approaches. So we're getting into data binding with Angular, Ember, and what we see here is we have the user's age and the location, and these are bound to your data model above. So if your data model changes at some point in time, then it also updates your views. And so this was actually inspired originally by these Windows Presentation Foundation. So it was something that they called XAML, and this was before Angular and Ember and all of these approaches. And then they took it to the web, basically. So there were some problems with these approaches, which we will see soon. But yeah, basically this was the new thing that they were offering. So this is an example of what it looks like in Ember as well. So React came along 2013. Well, that's when it was actually open sourced. Before it was in the Facebook code base, it was pretty tightly integrated there, and then they took it out, they extracted it into an open source project, they made it available for everybody, and it came to improve on these ideas. So it improved on, for instance, data binding. So instead of having to know about the scope object, so in Angular, or instead of having to know about how Ember updates all of your views, React's data binding is a lot more natural, and you don't think about it as much. So you can kind of forget about how it's being implemented. It just kind of works. It looks more like JavaScript. This is kind of a theme too. So Pete Hunt mentioned this in one of his talks, that it feels like you're just writing JavaScript. So React, that's what the idea behind React is. So this kind of goes a little bit into the idea of embracing standards. So they want to go towards this minimalistic kind of approach, this more JavaScript. You're basically just writing functions. And so React is kind of based on this. It's kind of a RESTful approach, actually, to UI development. So the way that it was described is you have a client and you have a server, and you hit it and then you re-render everything. And so basically with React, you're just declaring how it should look, and then you leave all the details to basically the diffing algorithm and how it's going to update the DOM eventually. So that was also an improved paradigm on just the imperative kind of approach to updating the DOM. Another one was JSX. So here we have JavaScript is being used instead of domain-specific language. So in this case, you don't need to know the details of your string-based language. So so in Ember or in Angular, you have strings that are going to be parsed, and they're going to look for these directives and things like that. And with JSX, this maps actually to, it maps to functions. And so React also has the paradigm of functional programming. So it was originally based on standard ML. So this was a functional language. So it was prototyped in this language by Jordan Walk. And it takes basically a pragmatic functional approach to things. So what that means is they are not going to hit you over the head and say, okay, you got to do everything functionally, and you're going to have to learn all of these new paradigms. But it kind of is like a gentle introduction to it, and you can use these things if you like. And they are actually very strongly in the framework of React, but you don't need to learn a whole lot of new stuff. And that makes you productive in it, and that's why it's this pragmatic approach to things. So that's what they mean by this, is that it's still accessible to developers of all skill levels. And so if you don't know functional programming, you can still give React a shot, and you can still get into it. So another thing that React promotes is immutability and unidirectional data flow. So that means that you don't actually have the same amount of power as you do with mutability, so you can't just change everything everywhere, but the kind of properties that you get from that, so that means that you don't need to worry about things being changed everywhere, and you don't need to think, oh, where's this bug coming from? It's a lot easier to find the source of your problems. Another thing that they have is the component model. So because it's based on functional programming, because it's based on this functional model, you have reusable stuff. You can compose things, so you can adapt components to different situations based on just the arguments that you're passing in, and it's also testable. And another nice property that we already kind of talked about is decoupled from the DOM, so that means that we can write to other output targets, so you can make different kinds of apps with it. We kind of already talked about this too, the minimalism. So they keep the API surface low, so they don't want to have too much proprietary APIs that you have to worry about to think about things. You're basically using the stuff that you already know from JavaScript. Another interesting thing that they do is that they actively remove stuff from React. So they try to minimalize it, and they try to keep it as small as they can. And yeah, it feels like using JavaScript. So how React embraces web standards so it's built on how widely spread JavaScript is. So that means JavaScript is, it has a lot of documentation on it already, a lot of people using it, and so they're hooking into that instead of trying to make their own proprietary ecosystem. So they would take the approach of using polyfills to write standards-based JavaScript. So that means that the polyfills for the things that I'm going to show you later, so the new proposals, for instance, so that you can get started with these new features before they're even available. And then JavaScript, the way they see it, JavaScript is actually a shareable intermediary format. So you're writing your behaviors in something that can be used across libraries. So if you do want to port to another library at some point, then you're using this kind of this common language. So this is basically their approach. So to try to listen to the standards committees when they can. However, they do curate stuff. So they decide when they want to take something and when they don't. So, for instance, like how can the how can you actually remove something from the web? So the answer is you can't, because you can't break the web. So one of the kind of tenets of the standards development is that you can't break old websites. So that's one thing that came pretty early on. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to promote certain styles of JavaScript, so that you go more in this direction, so that's more top of mind, and so that means that you have less to keep in your head when you're doing these, when you're programming. So they do also have a bit of a problem with some certain things, like the DOM. So we have the same thing from before, so that we have these verbose APIs. The declarative DOM updates just don't exist. There is no way to reactively update something without doing a lot of imperative stuff there. So tight coupling between HTML and CSS and the DOM model, and so the quirks of the foundation. So how attributes and properties work in HTML. So these are things that are kind of they've kind of always been around, and yeah, it's just something that that is problematic. So web components was an idea. So web components is basically these four things. So you have custom elements, templates, shadow DOM, and HTML imports, and these four things make up. It's like a component model for the web. So you can make your own custom things that should actually behave like an input, or like a drop down or anything like that. And it was a really cool thing. I mean, when I first learned about it, I thought, wow, this is the way to do things. So the problem with that is, so actually, just to quickly go over what these things are. So the custom elements basically allow you to define custom DOM nodes. Templates are they allow you to define inert. It's kind of like a string, but it's just an inert DOM that will be eventually later used as a template, and then it will be kind of rehydrated, I guess, in React terms. Yeah, so Shadow DOM allows you to do encapsulation. So encapsulation of styling, so that. Yeah, I don't know if you guys have had this problem before, where you have some particular class or you have some particular selector, and then it actually affects something that you didn't think it was going to affect, or through inheritance, through the cascade, you have some styling problems. So yeah, Shadow DOM deals with this, and it makes it easier. Makes it easier to develop, and HTML imports. So that's basically this is something that's actually not so hot right now, yeah, for reasons I'll describe later. But basically, it's you declare in your HTML, okay, I want to get this other HTML file, and then you can continue on with it. So there are advantages to this. So we talked about this Shadow DOM encapsulation. So there's no other way to do this exactly like Shadow DOM does it. It's really strong encapsulation. It's built into the platform. It's really nice, and it could actually. If it takes off at some point, it could become kind of like this interoperable standard. So that it could be kind of like the lingua franca, just like Facebook calls JavaScript right now. Just some kind of way that everyone can declare components. So that would be nice. It's a really nice idea. There are problems with it though. So that there's really no enforcement of a declarative API. So that means like a lot of the time you have these imperative ways of dealing with things, like the video tag I was showing you before. You have play, you have pause, and these can be like way far apart in your application. So sometimes you'll not be able to find the source of a bug, or it'll be more difficult at least. So this was the imperative API. The focus on composability, so that means that you can't have your data flowing through it, so from parent to child, the same way that you do with React. And the last thing is that web components embraces the DOM model that we have. So the DOM is problematic for the things that we described before, and web components goes basically all in on that. So yeah, it's unfortunate. Oh yeah, and no alternative render targets as well. So the standards proposals are basically something that come from these three guys in the Facebook ecosystem. So I'm going to be focusing on the React or React influenced web standards. And so this is Sebastian Mark Bourget, Jeff Morrison, and Jordan Harbant. So Jeff is also Facebook, and Jordan is Airbnb. And so this is kind of like the process that they go through. So they first, when they have an idea, they write a spec document. So it's usually something just on GitHub, just a markdown file or something like this. And then they go to the TC39 meeting, and then they say, okay, we'd like to get this to like a straw man phase. So just so that they put the idea in there, and then they talk about it. So they try to destroy the idea, or they try to find problems with it. So they get input, and then they have a real proposal. They have the challenges. They need to outline the challenges. They need to have a polyfill for it, for instance. And then it gets to draft phase, where it's more precise language. It gets more formal at this stage. And then if it really looks nice, it gets signed off, and then it basically goes to implementers. So implementers like the browser vendors, then they need to actually make a version of this. And if there's 2 or more compatible implementations that's shipped to users, and there's a large amount of feedback available from users, then we get to stage 4. And stage 4 is pretty much the last thing, and then you're looking at inclusion in the spec. So basically, then it goes into the next version of ES ECMAScript, so that it's just like ES 2017, 2018, whatever. Yeah, so that's the proposal process that they go through. The goals so this is my opinion actually, but these are the goals that I see being followed by the React ecosystem in terms of standards. So it's basically to lower the paradigms into the language. So what I mean by that is you have these paradigms that are beautiful, and you think, okay, these are great ideas, but they're more in user land, so in libraries or in frameworks. And if you can somehow pull those back into the real language, then you can reduce the libraries, and you can improve everything for everybody. So another thing is to add low-level APIs, so things that already exist in the browser, for instance, and just expose those to users, so to allow them low-level primitives that they can work with. Another thing is to improve developer experience. So one tenet of React is to have a really nice developer experience, and they also follow this in standards, as I will show. And lastly, this is more of like a long-term thing, is to make React obsolete. So that's basically to get to this point where actually we don't really need React anymore, because there's a nice alternative model. So I'll show basically some of these kinds of things. So Cheng Lu is kind of thinking about this a little bit in this Taming the Meta Language talk, if you guys have seen that. So at some point this may come. So here's an example of a specification. So this is the REST spread properties. Maybe you guys have already used this. So basically, in the first one here, we have a REST property at the very end, and that's just taking the last two properties, so A and B. And another way of doing it is spreading. So actually, these are two different features, but so spreading allows you to put. If you have another object, then it basically puts those in those place into the object. And so this is basically showing declarativity. So you're reducing the amount of boilerplate that you need to do to do this kind of thing. Another thing is so this was actually. This is from the React docs. So it's just showing some examples of where this is being used. So in React and Redux. Another example is the silent property access. So this was a spec that it was actually, I don't believe it was proposed. But it's basically, it shows you that it's being set as undefined, so you're not going to have these these type errors that are going to be thrown. And so this was one way of doing it. Another way that's actually becoming a little bit more popular right now is this optional chaining. So this is a newer standard. Now it's at stage 1, and this does basically the same thing. So if you're accessing a property from something that's like null or undefined, then you're just going to get undefined back. And so this increases your declarativity. So if you have some kind of declarative template, like if you have some JSX or something like that, then you can just use the properties as you would. So you don't need to have all of these guards built in and everything. It also does, so this optional chaining, Sebastian's proposal didn't do this, but the optional chaining also allows you to do methods and functions. Yeah, so the class fields is another one. This is something that's also from the in the React docs. So basically, this was actually a little bit of a longer running proposal. Before it was called class properties, I think, or something else. And now it's class fields. It's basically like there's the private and the public class fields. So the third property being, so the private property one, that's actually private, and it's private to the class. It can't be accessed from outside of the scope. And yeah, so it allows you to declaratively instantiate these things, as opposed to doing it in a constructor or some other place that's spread all around. So yeah, this was the place that is in the React docs right now. So it's just basically a click handler right here, and so yeah, that was the example there. So this was another one. This built actually on top of the class proposal, the class fields proposal. So basically, instead of doing the second version here, you just need to do the thing at the top, and it will initialize these things for you. So this is something I don't think it's been proposed yet. So yes, Sebastian and other people, they have these specs that they write, but they just haven't taken the time to propose them, because it takes a lot of time, I guess, in the meetings, in the TC39 meetings. So you don't want to bring up everything, and you don't want to waste people's time. So this is another example of what's possible with this scoped constructor arguments. So in this case, you're actually you're capturing the arguments so that they can be used inside of a method, and in a static method they aren't being used because that doesn't have access to the constructor. So yeah, it's kind of a confusing, maybe a little bit strange syntax when you first look at it, but it allows you to be more declarative in how you want things to appear. So from a functional programming kind of approach, so this was something that's been recently proposed from Sebastian and Brian, and so this is pattern matching. So if your vector, so that if the argument that you're passing in there matches one of these patterns, then it will basically return the result there. So yeah. Another one was so Dave Herman. He's from Mozilla, and he's doing this do expressions. So it allows you to return stuff within these curly braces. So basically, it's like a function, but it's an expression. So if you look at it from a JSX perspective, you can basically do these instead of just like a simple ternary, which maybe you guys have had inlined. Then you can do a little bit more complex kind of things. So you can have multiple cases that you're going through. Another one. So this one also falls under the functional programming umbrella is so object entries and object values. So this is also something that is available to use right now. So this one, you just basically get back. So this is actually in the spec already. You get back an array. So this allows you to work with the arrays in this kind of functional style to iterate over them or to modify them in certain ways. And so to move on to like immutability, so this was actually something that was proposed. So immutable data structures was proposed to be a part of JavaScript way back in 2015 already, but nothing. Yeah, it didn't go actually past the first proposal. So it was not something that. It was a large overhead because it would have meant double data structures actually. So that if you have like an object versus a record, or if you have this vector versus an array, that would have added a lot of complexity, and so implementers weren't ready to do this yet. Also, the shallow equality test. So if you're working with immutable data structures, then you can quickly just compare two objects that have the same thing. And this would be useful in the case of memoization. Another one from Jordan was the get own property descriptors. So this one actually also made it into the spec, and it allows you to do like easier copying of objects. So just more proper copying. So I was also talking about developer experience. So one thing that Jeff Morrison proposed is to have this kind of trailing commas. So in this case, we don't have the trailing commas, and this would be, for instance, after a change. And param2 and param3 bar and baz, they're going to be all changed in your, for instance, in your git diff or in your any kind of version control when you have to add the third parameter. So this is basically just tooling improvements, just a way to make it a little bit nicer to be able to look back through the history of your code. So it just looks like this. So you can add in function calls, and then also in the declarations of functions, you can have the trailing comma at the end. So this actually made it into the spec too. I'm not sure in which browsers is available now, but yeah, this will be available. So you might be thinking, like, why hasn't there been more progress? Like, why don't we have already JSX in the spec? Why don't we have it in the language? Why can't we use it everywhere? And so the thing is that these kinds of things, they sometimes are maybe a little bit too much for the time. So why can't we make these big changes? Why can't we move really fast? So if we move really fast, then a lot of new features get added. The thing is, with the web, you can't really remove anything. So this is the thing that I was talking about before. You don't want to break the web. So you don't want to add a whole bunch of new things. So for instance, if we added the jQuery API, like basically all of the jQuery methods, then that would need to be supported basically for the rest of time, the way that things are going right now. So yeah, that's the kind of thing. So you want to make sure that things are mature, and you want to make sure that things work in a large variety of different use cases. And so one way forward is to expose more browser APIs. So I was talking about this a little bit earlier. The thing that we have here is something that is kind of like the extensible web manifesto. So I don't know if you guys have heard about this. This is like a manifesto that basically says, okay, we want to expose the primitives, we want to expose the very low-level things, so that library authors can move forward and show us the way, basically. So show us how things are going to go. And so this is one thing that we can look at in terms of future as well. So React has also have other influences, so not just on web standards, but also on, for instance, on Angular. So Angular, the Angular included this unidirectional data flow, so single direction data flow. So this was kind of a follow-up to React's popularity. Ember also had this unidirectional and also component-first kind of model, so for the views. So this was also taken from React. Polymer, I'm not sure if you guys heard about this, like Polymer Summit that just happened. It was in August, I think, and they said, okay, yeah, we're going to get rid of these HTML imports. We're not going to do that anymore, and we're going to go with the ES6 imports. So ES6 is one thing that has, or the module system has. It's been one thing that's really been promoted by React and the ecosystem and other libraries as well. Vue has also taken a lot from React's playbook. So if you look at a Vue component versus a React component, it's there's a lot of similarities, and even web components. So the web components people, like, even though there's a lot of differences between them, and there's a lot of so web components are very tightly coupled to the DOM, which it's not really compatible with this React model. There has been some kind of, there's a lot of talk going on. So for instance, Rob Dodson is one of the guys that's very involved in web components, and he says that, you know, they're talking about this, they're hearing these things, and they're getting some of their inspiration from that. You don't know where it's going to go, but for the future, there's different directions. And so, for instance, one of the things is integration. So one thing that you can do with web components, so if you want to integrate between the two things, so if you want to integrate between like web components and React, one thing that you can do is to use the web components as leaf components. So within your React components today, you're already using like stuff for your leaf components. So you're using like inputs, you're using these different kinds of tags that are available in HTML. And what you could do there is you could use web components. So you could integrate that way. So this was Andre Stolz that mentioned that one. Adi Osmani also had this idea. Another thing, so these are different approaches. There's a little bit of a different approach, is reactive elements and skate.js. So they combine web components and React in different kinds of ways. So they're using the API of web components or React and combining them. So alternative specifications is also kind of like a potential future, like with this Unity component specification by Sean Larkin. So Sean is one of the Webpack guys, and I think he's part of Microsoft now. And yeah, so what he is proposing here is a unified way of defining components in a single file component. So that means like you have one file per component, kind of like React or Vue. And yeah, he's saying, okay, we can make a standardized model for this. Don't know where it's going to go, but that was just recently, just this year. So alternatives to the DOM is also a different option. So for instance, Douglas Crockford, so in 2015, he proposed this way of dealing with things called a helper app. So this was something so that people could move off of the existing web onto a new kind of web. So basically you have this DOM model and maybe you want to get rid of it. How do you get rid of it? And his model was kind of like a set-top box model. So if you guys know this set-top box that you put on top of your TV and that allowed you to do the transition to satellite, that was his kind of idea, that you have this extra application that helps the browser understand the new web, so to say. So if you want to create a new specification, how do you move away from the old web? Another thing was so Ken Wheeler's app browser. So he proposes something that where you can use native apps, so you can browse native apps on the web. So this would be some different way of using a different component model. So instead of using the DOM, you're using native components basically, and you can do that with React Native. Another future, so something that's a little bit closer to my heart is this Reason ML. So Reason is a new language by Facebook. It's just basically syntax on top of OCaml, and so it allows you to have strong typing and things like that. So there are different approaches here, and Reason may be something that may interest you as well. So that's pretty much it. The takeaways are standards move slowly and they need consensus. So they're fundamentally different than a normal library kind of monoculture approach. React does embrace web standards, but they choose which ones they do embrace, and they do propose other options. We probably need a better model than the DOM. The DOM is probably not good enough, and so it would be nice if we had something new. If we can somehow lower the React paradigms like functional programming and immutability into the language, then we can make the web better for everybody. And so new low-level APIs, they will enable you alternative approaches. So like this extensible web manifesto, this enables new libraries, new frameworks. And lastly, this the DOM alternatives that we were talking about. So yeah, using app browser and helper app and things like that. So yeah, that was it. Yeah, are there any questions? Oh, one second. Right, okay, so the question is...
Not just the fact languages and frameworks, molecules and stuff like that.
Right. So the question was, is it possible that arrow functions and other types of features like this, is it possible that they have been inspired by other languages? And yes, the answer is yes, by all means. There's a lot of cross-pollination that always goes on. And you know that for instance, the optional attributes. This was or optional properties. That was something that was inspired in part by languages like Ruby and things like that. So yeah, there's always like a little bit of looking left and right. So there's stuff like F#, Rust. People look at these types of things when they're coming up with new proposals for JavaScript, which is really interesting because JavaScript is inspired by a lot of different things.
What's being posed and what stage they're in?
There is something. Let's see if I can I do something here? Yeah, I can. So it's called, oh, my internet doesn't work. But yeah, if you just look at that, maybe I can zoom in. Oh, I can zoom in. There you go. So this is basically, this will show you the proposals that are available for the TC39. It's a compilation of the stuff that's in the GitHub repo. You can also just look in the GitHub repo, but then you need to click around a little bit. You can also look at the meeting notes. So if this is interesting to any of you guys, you can actually read what the various people are saying about certain things. They say a lot of really technical things that are sometimes hard to understand, like using the words expandos and stuff like that. If you follow it a little bit more, then you get into it. Any other? Oh.
Regarding the immutability we were talking about, is there any way to make it without Redux or generalizable?
So to make immutability without, so in JavaScript there's no real immutability, and so if you're using Redux, it's basically just a pattern that you're following. So there's no real immutability. That's what the proposal was to add. But there are other libraries out there that follow this kind of immutable pattern. I can't give you any good ones off the top of my head, but yeah. In a native way, immutability, maybe you could do something with symbols, but it's still not going to be real immutability. Sorry, object freeze, that's one way that you can, sorry.
That you introduced like something like static variables, so like private variables that are going to be introduced later.
Yeah.
We've seen this in languages like C++, C#, Java, and other, the object-oriented languages.
Yeah.
So are they there like to improve the memory management in browsers, or just to help the developer, or like a combination of those two mainly? Because I don't think I've read private properties spec or private class field spec. I think it was mainly for encapsulation though. So it was mainly to. I'll just go back to it here. I think it was mainly for that encapsulation for the privacy itself. Yeah.
So you talked about reason ML, and how would you compare it to L, and which one would you use, or?
I don't actually know too much about Elm, so I can't make that comparison very well. As far as I know, no, I don't think I can
make a really good answer for that. But from the reason perspective, it is based on a different language. So it's based on, I know that Elm is as well, but it's a much more fully kind of, so it's based on OCaml, which has been in development for a very, very, very long time. So maybe that's like a half answer.
I think we need to move on. Thank you, Grant.
Yeah.